let's just recall that in domestic demand for goods, keep in mind we're looking at domestic demand, i.e. domestic or foreign goods bought by domestic residents. While in demand for domestic goods, we're looking at domestic goods bought by domestic or foreign residents. So it's important to keep in mind in domestic demand for goods, we're looking at domestic demand for domestic or foreign goods. And in demand for domestic goods, we're looking at domestic goods, whether bought by domestic or foreign residents. Now, let's move on and let's look at how do we plot domestic demand for goods, which we label DD, and demand for domestic goods, which we label ZZ, against output on a graph where we have demand on the vertical axis and output on the horizontal axis, keeping constant all other variables, the interest rate, taxes, government spending, foreign output, and the real exchange rate that affect demand. And for convenience, we'll assume both are straight lines rather than curves. This is just an assumption for simplicity. Now here we can see the line DD plots domestic demand for goods C plus I plus G as a function of output Y, where we know C depends upon Y, and depending on our assumptions, we may assume that I depends upon Y as well. The line ZZ plots demand for domestic goods, which is domestic demand for goods C plus I plus G plus net exports, which are exports minus imports. So here we can see that both of them are going to be upward sloping because when you increase Y, C increases. Right, and depending on our assumptions, I may increase as well. So both demand for domestic goods increases and domestic demand for domestic goods increases and domestic demand for goods also increases. But ZZ has a flatter slope, right? So both are upward sloping because increasing income increases C, and depending on assumptions, investment also increases if we're assuming investment depends upon Y. But ZZ has a flatter slope. Now, why is that? Because when income increases, some of the additional domestic demand falls on foreign goods rather than domestic goods. So as income increases, DD increases more than ZZ. Because when income increases, we know consumption is increasing. But in the case of ZZ, that part of increase in consumption, which is going on imports, is removed by subtracting imports. So that is why DD increases more than ZZ. Because the increase in the case of DD also incorporates the increase in imports that happen with income, but in the case of ZZ, we subtract out the increase in imports, right? So when income increases, the additional domestic demand that falls on foreign goods rather than domestic goods has been removed from ZZ. So the increase in ZZ is less than increase in DD because in that case, we know that the increase as income increases, we're removing out the imports from ZZ. So DD also incorporates the increase in imports that happens with increase in income. So in that case, the increase in domestic demand that we're accounting for is higher. So remember, keep in mind the difference between DD and ZZ. ZZ does not include imports, which DD does, which is why when income increases, the increase in DD is more because DD accounts for, also includes the increase in imports that happens with the increase in income, but ZZ removes that imports. ZZ includes exports, which DD doesn't, but exports we know don't depend upon domestic income. So both are upward sloping, but ZZ has a flatter slope because now what is happening is as income increases, some of the additional domestic demand falls on foreign goods rather than domestic goods. And this domestic demand that's falling on foreign goods is included in DD but not in ZZ. Now the vertical difference between, we know ZZ and DD is equal to net exports because we know DD C plus I plus G, ZZ is DD plus NX. So it essentially gives us the value of net exports at any given value of Y. Right, we know ZZ is DD plus NX, so NX is ZZ minus DD. Here ZZ is above DD, so net exports are positive. Here ZZ is below DD, so net exports are negative. Here ZZ is equal to DD, so net exports are zero. So the level of output at which we have a balanced trade, i.e. net exports are zero, occurs at intersection of ZZ and DD. Right, and if we assume the economy has zero trade balance at the goods market equilibrium, then the intersection of ZZ and DD occur at the 45-degree line. Why is that? Because we know goods market equilibrium occurs at intersection of ZZ and the 45-degree line. And since we're assuming that in goods market equilibrium, we have a balanced trade. So this is also the level of output at which DD and ZZ intersect. So the key things to remember here is that ZZ and DD are both upward sloping. ZZ is flatter than DD, and the vertical difference between them is equal to net exports. So the intersection is where we have a balanced trade.